OPB Podcasts.
Live from the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, December 4th. We in Portland are 4 days past a notable date, Mayor Keith Wilson's self-imposed deadline for ending unsheltered homelessness. So how are things going? And Governor Tina Kotek announced a notable goal of her own this week. She wants to reverse the growing sense that Oregon is bad for business. We'll tackle two of the major political issues facing Oregon this week. They just happen to feature two of the state's most prominent politicians. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
And I'm OPB Portland Politics reporter Alex Zielinski.
Before we start this week, I want to note we are streaming this live on opb.org and on OPB's YouTube page. If you are watching and you have questions about Portland or state politics, share them in the chat. We will try to answer as we go. Alex, you have been busy for a lot of reasons, I think, covering City Hall this year. For one, Portland is experimenting with a brand new form of government that no one quite knows how it works. But another is Mayor Keith Wilson set what I think seemed to many an eye-rollingly impossible goal at the outset of his term. He wanted to end unsheltered homelessness in the state by December. We talked about this a lot by now, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times on the podcast, but remind us, what was his plan?
Yeah, well, first, I think a definition of unsheltered homelessness would be useful. That's anyone who lives outside or in a vehicle. It doesn't include people who spend the night in a shelter or crash on their friend's couch. So Wilson pledged to end unsheltered homelessness by opening up hundreds of new shelter beds, 1,500 to be exact. These beds would be in facilities run by different service providers and nonprofits spread across the city, and they're all overnight only, which is a bit abnormal for shelters in the city. That means they open at 8 p.m. and people have to leave by 6 a.m. It's set up a little bit more like those emergency shelters during cold weather or heat waves. Yeah. Wilson paired this shelter strategy with a plan to begin enforcing the city's camping ban. We've talked about this before on the podcast, but that policy was adopted last year by the city. Wilson has halted its enforcement until last month, since he was waiting to have more shelter beds available to offer people camping on public property a place to go. But having that penalty as a tool to move people off the streets, that's always been a key part of his plan as well. So Wilson, like you said, gave himself a deadline for his plan to work. And I can't emphasize enough how this deadline was entirely Wilson's creation based on his campaign pledge. No one else told him he needed to go with December 1st. But yeah, that deadline to end unsheltered homelessness in Portland was the 1st of this month.
And he is big on setting ambitious goals and working like nonstop to get there. I think that's a big part of his whole shtick, right?
Sure. He famously works 7 days a week.
Yes. Well, it is December 4th today, as I said up top. I mean, based on what I've seen just traveling around Portland over the last 3 days, it doesn't look like Wilson has met his mark. People are still outside. What has he accomplished at this point?
You're right. I don't think it's controversial to say that Wilson has not ended unsheltered homelessness, but he has reached a part of his goal. He did find funding and locations for all 1,500 shelter beds in the city. However, those beds aren't all currently available. Right now, there are just around 900 of those new beds that are actually open for use. The rest are still being ruled out and located. Wilson has also opened up one outdoor day center, essentially an empty lot in Northwest Portland where people can get information about social services, take a shower, use Wi-Fi, other things. And like I already mentioned, he's starting to have police enforce the camping ban. That's 6 people with a criminal citation if they are camping on public property and refuse to relocate or to move into shelter. While, I may sound a little skeptical of this self-imposed deadline, I do think Wilson is owed some credit for getting all these shelter beds sited. That required winning over several different governments to get additional funding for this plan, since Portland's budget definitely couldn't pay for it all. And then getting shelter providers to agree to operate and open these facilities. And in the context of city government, which operates at its snail's pace, this rollout is pretty remarkable.
Well, and we've seen past mayors make bold claims on homelessness. Mayor Ted Wheeler came into office making bold claims about ending homelessness. I'm not sure he ever had as quick or sort of as sweeping a success in that first year as this. I do think you can compare this
pace to the pace of funding that we got during the American Rescue Plan that went towards opening up a bunch of outdoor villages in Portland.
Right.
And that was pretty fast, but that was because we had this huge pot of money that we don't have now that has since dried up. So
Okay, so we have a bunch of shelter beds. We don't have as many as Portland has houseless people. It's clear there are people still living unsheltered. I mean, you said you don't think it's controversial that he hasn't solved it, but how does Wilson actually say it? Does he acknowledge, hey, I haven't met my pledge, or is he saying unsheltered homelessness is solved? How is he painting it?
He says he has met his goal. If you look at his social media, you'll see him beaming next to one of those thermometer posters people use to measure fundraising, and the thermometer is filled up to represent all of the shelter beds he has funded and opened. And in terms of ending unsheltered homelessness, he has kind of come up with a new definition of what that means. Wilson has said that just by having available shelter beds, he has created the framework to, quote, end unsheltered homelessness. And the path and the framework rather than fully ending it. I'd say there's a lot of magical thinking involved here. Last month, I asked Wilson what would happen if on December 1st people were still living unsheltered. Here's what he said.
Well, it's just a matter of time. It's going to get very cold through the winter. We're going to continue to be offering them services. At some point, they're going to want to come in.
So he believes that cold weather and the gentle nudge of the law will be enough to erase people from Portland streets. But we haven't seen that yet. I will note that the most recent shelter data shared by the city showed that on average, the new 900 or so shelter beds across Portland were barely over 50% occupied in October. By comparison, Multnomah County's roughly 3,000 shelter beds that are open 24 hours are closer to 90%. And that was from September. That's the most recent data. So, interesting comparison.
Yeah, and we have seen him say, well, actually, what it means to end unsheltered homelessness is when someone's ready to come inside, there is a place for them.
Yeah.
Which almost seems like he's saying, let's end involuntary unsheltered homelessness, but not necessarily if people are being a little more difficult or want to stay outside. I don't know. I mean, it gets a little muddy. There's a lot to unpack and explore, I think, on this subject. This is a politics podcast, and there are some interesting city politics on this. I mean, the way Wilson has approached this certainly doesn't have unanimous political support. I think that would be an understatement.
Yeah, it does not. What's interesting, though, is that there really hasn't been much pushback until this week and maybe last week. City electeds were really giving Wilson time to see his plan through to his deadline before critiquing it. But now the floodgates are open. To start us off, here's Councilor Angelita Murillo speaking at a council meeting yesterday morning.
Of course, everyone wants a kumbaya moment. We got 1,500 shelter beds. Well, guess what? The goalpost was moved because the goal was to end unsheltered homelessness on December 1st. That's not what happened.
And yesterday afternoon, several other city councilors joined a cadre of homeless service nonprofit leaders outside City Hall to call for more housing-focused solutions to homelessness. That's really been the biggest critique, that the mayor has opened up a ton of shelter beds, but that there's really little investment in moving people from shelter into permanent housing, that it feels more of a Band-Aid than a cure. There's also real concern from people who have spent years working with Portland's homeless community, who've run housing programs, that the mayor isn't really interested in their input.
Yeah.
That he's not turning to local expertise and instead basing his policy on what's worked in other cities, which can sometimes feel like comparing apples to oranges.
So Councilor Murillo at least is saying, well, actually, you haven't met your goal,
Sure.
Mayor. You've done, you've opened 1,500 cots or whatever. But, you took a long look at how things have gone. I think that you guys published December 1st with that. And it does seem like a lot of people you talk to are willing to hear Wilson out, give his approach a chance. And if he's not sort of pivoting with evidence that it might not be working, then maybe they'll reserve judgment for then. But I am curious, given the backlash we are seeing, whether or not he is likely to have time to see it through. I mean, what sense do we have whether this city council will support funding these shelters for another year when budget time rolls around?
Yeah, I don't know. If the vote was today, I'd say no. Many councilors are in agreement across the very narrow political spectrum that is Portland City Council that this plan isn't delivering right now. We have a trio of counselors who all represent District 1 in East Portland who have introduced a plan to take unspent funding in the city's housing bureau and spend it on a slate of different programs that would help move people into housing and prevent them from becoming homeless with things like eviction defense. It's money that the mayor has hinted at spending on housing programs, but not in the same way these counselors have suggested. So they're essentially saying, we don't trust what you will do with more money to address homelessness. Here's what we want to do. One of those city councilors is Jamie Dunphy. Here's what he told me last month about funding the mayor's plan for a second year.
I won't be supporting a year or two of the mayor's shelter plan. We cannot afford it, and it's not effective. And I always was worried that it was going to simply be a checkbox that as soon as he was able to check the box, he would start using the violence of police authority to crack down. And that's exactly what's already starting to happen.
So counselors are skeptical. I think they're really waiting to see if Wilson is willing to pivot or maybe adapt his plan a bit based on what he's learned so far. And I think if he's willing to do that, he's going to earn a lot of goodwill from counselors and folks who might support his plan going forward a bit further.
And what is he? I mean, they are saying, okay, you're warehousing people every night. You're not doing anything to actually connect them to housing or make sure that they get out of homelessness. You need to be focused on that. What does he say to those assertions?
Yeah, well, he's kind of entering a chapter 2 of his policy. And earlier this week, his staff told me that he's going to be bringing that same kind of fast-moving apparatus that he set up to swiftly open shelter beds to deal with housing, that now the focus is housing. He has this new committee, the housing strike team, which I feel like requires electronic laser sounds when I say it. If only we were set up like a shock jock radio station. Anyways, this strike team will work on breaking down bureaucratic hurdles, on getting people into housing, identifying buildings that can be turned into housing, removing barriers for developers to build more housing. So to answer your question, Wilson is saying he's now doing the work to get people housed, which I think a number of critics say should have been happening simultaneously, but here we are.
We have talked almost exclusively about what politicians think about this at this point. Makes sense for what our podcast talks about, but something that's been striking about a lot of your coverage, Alex, is you have gone out and talked to folks who are using the shelters, how they feel about it. We've talked about that in other recent podcasts, but since then you've talked to even more people. You were out on Thanksgiving, I think. What have you been hearing lately from the people who are using these overnight shelters?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. It's always worth underscoring that homeless people are not a monolith. And what I've heard reflects that. Some people really appreciate the shelters for having a pretty accessible process, being really helpful in a pinch, an emergency when there's nowhere else to go, especially when it's cold. And they say they've been treated respectfully at these new spaces. Others say they don't like being forced to leave before 6 a.m. when it's still dark outside and they don't really have anywhere to go. Right. And others say they don't feel comfortable sleeping in these types of shelters, which are all big rooms with rows of beds. And there isn't much privacy, and sleep is disrupted frequently by others. Another thing that's unique about these shelters that I haven't mentioned, unlike most shelters in the region, there are no social workers or programs on site to help connect people with services like healthcare, addiction treatment, job training, or maybe most importantly, housing. I talked to some people who stayed at these shelters who were all really interested in getting help and moving out of the shelter, but since it wasn't offered there, they felt a little stuck. A number of people also wish these shelters were open all day long, especially as the days grow colder. I spoke to a couple of men last week on Thanksgiving, actually, who had stayed at an overnight shelter and said that they had planned on spending that day just riding the max light rail to stay warm until the shelter opened that night.
Oof, not a particularly heartening Thanksgiving plan. I am looking at the man behind the glass, Andrew Thien, our editor. He says we have a question from the YouTube. Andrew?
We do. We have a listener who's saying basically, it's definitely not just Portland with this problem. After returning home to Southern Oregon after 25 years, I barely recognize the place. Roseburg has homeless camps and crazies all over is what this person wrote. But what gives? Obviously, you both have reported on housing and mental health issues around the state. It's It is all around the state.
Yeah, I mean, we have seen a well-documented housing shortage in the state. Most people would point to that as the reason housing costs are up and people are falling into homelessness. There's obviously also a safety net that is not entirely whole in terms of mental health. I mean, I will say we hear a lot of debate from this in the legislative context because there have been state laws passed that, try to make it a little more difficult or a little more considered for cities to enforce camping bans. A lot of cities believe that those are too much, that, there is an effort to overturn these laws. Other folks say they're just common sense. And if you want to move people around, you need to take a considered approach and make sure you're not just sweeping away the problem, but not actually doing anything good. But I think, very fair to say that we have seen this problem sort of explode from Portland, where it has long been an issue, out to the farther, different parts of the state.
Yeah, it's not just here. And it's not just in Oregon, right? It's like
right.
a national
Nationally.
West Coast issue. Yeah. Well, Dirk, let's pivot. Let's turn to a story that you covered this week about another entrenched issue, the state's flagging economy.
Yeah.
Governor Tina Kotek has a new plan. She says, we'll turn this all around. Well, tell us, what's her plan?
Yeah. There are not all that many details, I will say at this point, but we do know what Governor Kotek says she wants to attempt. So she wants to speed up economic growth in the state. By that, I mean, I think she wants to increase the growth of our state's domestic product, gross domestic product. She wants to help businesses expand and develop more easily and quickly. And she wants to make sure Oregon has better training so that when businesses are expanding, they have a workforce that they can hire that is homegrown. Kotek rolled this out in this kind of flashy appearance at a Tualatin semiconductor firm, Lam Research, on Tuesday. She was flanked by all sorts of business honchos. Tim Boyle was in attendance and spoke. Here is part of what the governor said she wants to do.
So today I am here to lift up and emphasize that Oregon is open for business. Thank you. We are ready to roll up our sleeves to support business and create more good-paying jobs for Oregonians.
Pretty well-trod territory, that open for business line, I have to say. You hear it in any state that this comes about. But she has some metrics she wants to achieve. So, for instance, Kotek wants the state to be in the top 10 of states in this CNBC ranking of the nation's business environment. Right now, we are 39th after plummeting, actually, in the latest rating. I think we plummeted 11 spots from 24 to 25. She says we need to be in the top 10. But, what it all looks like, as I said, has few specifics. She wants to hire what she calls a chief prosperity officer, and she wants to appoint this new prosperity council that's going to arrive at recommendations that they will then move forward and try to pass some new policy. And that's basically where we stand.
Well, Kotek has been governor for 3 years. It's kind of interesting hearing this now. She has stayed really laser focused in those 3 years on housing and schools. The economy, not so much, right? Like, why is the state of Oregon's economy suddenly emerging as this top concern?
Yeah, this big new
Why are we
initiative.
only open for business now?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there are a number of reasons, right? One is that there are just more and more indications that Oregon is not headed in the right direction economically. We have seen, I have a list here. We have seen unemployment rising quickly, actually more quickly than any other state in the country in a recent release. The economy is now growing more slowly than the nation as a whole. That's new. We typically grow more quickly. Portland has obviously struggled to recover from the pandemic, everyone knows. I mentioned this increasing notion that we are just not business friendly, as reflected in that CNBC study. And there was another really interesting study that came out this year from the University of Oregon, actually, that showed plenty of Oregon businesses are opting to expand not in Oregon, but elsewhere, because often other states are aggressively and successfully sort of courting them. And there's this other recent presentation from John Taponia at Eco Northwest. We need to say he is a board member at OPB, but he's been giving this a lot to a lot of business groups. And it sort of collates and takes all this data in the form of a PowerPoint presentation. And it just says, Oregon is no longer, look at all this data. Oregon is no longer this place that people are flocking to, that they want to go. We need to do something different if we want our economy to grow. And if we don't, we are going to stagnate. Maybe we are going to lapse into a recession. So all that is sort of the economic picture. There's a lot and it's been growing, but we should mention something else. And not to be overly cynical, Alex, but this also may have to do with a bit of breaking news today. Kotek announced this morning what pretty much everyone had been expecting for months at this point. She is running for re-election next year. And, with this announcement on Tuesday, I think she can point to something on the campaign trail to show she's taking the state's economic straits seriously, even if that's, as you say, just been 2 days that the state's been open for business. We're open now. Maybe that's what she'll say.
Well, the kind of things that Kotek is talking about, they're often suggestions that we hear from Republicans, not necessarily her party. What's been their reaction to this pivot, to this pretty quick turn 3 years down the line? What are you hearing from businesses as well?
Yeah. So, Republicans have been very skeptical of this. I think they've signaled they would be supportive if Kotek does some of the things that they would support, things like reducing business taxes, obviously, rolling back land use protections, slashing red tape. Kotek is talking about some of that, not necessarily all of it, and there's really no indication she'd go as far as many Republicans want. The folks we've heard from in the GOP are also just saying that the governor is doing this sort of cynically. She's doing it because she's identified an election year vulnerability and she needs to be able to say she's doing something. They would say, she's been in power for a long time. They will say, as she runs for re-election, she has been in power for a long time. She is culpable in the state of the business climate, and she needs to be held accountable. You asked about business. I think that there is some of the same cynicism from businesses, but also some hope. They have really argued for years, right, that policies, regulations that are being rolled out by Democrats are just harmful to the state's business climate. And I think often they have gotten maybe rolled eyes or people thinking that they are crying wolf. I spoke with Angela Wilhelms this week. She is the president of Oregon Business and Industry. It's a major business lobbying group in the state. Here is part of what she told me.
For a number of years, OBI has and others in the business community have been talking about bills that make the business climate worse, rules that make the business climate worse, executive orders that make the business climate worse. And those things continue to get advanced and pushed through.
But, as I said, I think businesses also see this whole thing on Tuesday and this new initiative as hopeful. They say they're glad the governor seems to be coming around to their point of view. They will support her efforts to improve things, basically.
I have to say, it seems like a tricky balance that Kotek is trying to strike, right? She's talking about business benefits, maybe even tax breaks, at a time Oregon is already expecting big budget deficit. How is that going to work?
Yeah, that is a very, very interesting question, and one I have too. She is on one hand saying the state needs to do things like invest in infrastructure, right? That's going to make it easier for business to expand. And she may want to explore tax changes that might make the state more competitive, right? But at the same time, Oregon is looking at serious budgetary headwinds. They are going to be faced with billions in lost federal funding beginning really next year, but actually in a major way in 2027 when they craft a new 2-year budget. How they reconcile that while trying to boost business enticements, if that's what they want to do, is just not clear. And they also have been saying more and more in the legislature, though, that boosting business may be the answer to some of our budgetary problems, because if you're growing the tax base, if you have more workers paying the state's income tax, you will ultimately have more revenue, and that is potentially going to help our budget issues. But I just don't know how they do it at a time we're also facing budget cuts, difficult decisions about where to spend our money. Can they justify making business tax breaks or whatever that might do that? I just don't know. It is very hard for me to imagine that they would go as far, given this climate and just given the general posture of Democrats, that they would go as far as many businesses would want them to go.
So a lot of unknowns. And as you said earlier, there's a lot of unknowns in the plan as a whole.
Yeah.
When do you expect to learn more about her proposal?
Yeah, so she announced the leaders of this new Prosperity Council on Tuesday. She says she'll pick the rest of the council by the end of the year, and she'll hire this new prosperity officer in her office by the end of the year. So then presumably they will get to work in figuring out what actual changes need to come. The governor did say she is going to push a bill in next year's short session in February that will be aimed at essentially slashing red tape and ensuring that businesses that are pursuing major developments that might add jobs or help the economy are going to face fewer barriers to do so. She wants to fast track those kinds of developments.
And I can imagine a bill like that. It's something shiny that she can point to on the campaign trail as well.
Yeah, I expect to hear a lot about that on the campaign trail. Okay, let's leave it there today. Alex, thanks as always for joining me.
You know what? Thank you for joining me.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.